So one other quick thing I want to point out real quick is that now, fairly obviously, a 3-shell tomb like this one, or even a 2-shell tomb, is going to be pretty well and good these days, because more than 2 or 3 people aren't going to die in a year in a single family unless there's a huge family tragedy. But for back when this cemetery opened, and throughout the 1800s, between war, crime, disease, family tragedies were a daily occurrence. So what happens back then, if say you start the year with this tomb empty, but then come July, yellow fever epidemic strikes, 4 people in the family die. What do you do with that extra dead family member? You need short-term rentals. That's what these are for. These are called wall vaults. Also, given their shape, they are sometimes referred to as oven tombs or oven vaults. They were originally designed for tomb overflow. You'd put the person in there, they'd break down over the year and the day the exact same way, and then you go ahead, take out their remains, and put their remains on into the family tomb. But you'll notice permanent markers on some of these. It's because by the early 1800s, people started figuring out that, you know what? Probably a lot cheaper to just keep renting one of these out than to buy a plot, build up a tomb, and things like that. And so they just started renting them out in perpetuity. The Catholic Church started offering 100-year leases, and in that case, once it all breaks down, you rush everyone to the back of the tomb, and at that point, there is 2 possible options. Either there's a crevice and a caveau, and so then you hang out not only with your family for all of eternity, but also all your neighbors for all of eternity. So if you settled your grudges before you die, you can kind of think of it as like an awesome block party in the afterlife. But some of these, the older ones, don't have crevices. They don't have caveaux, because they were never meant to be permanent burial structures. And so in that case, you rush everyone to the back, slide in the new coffin, you repeat that over a few generations, and eventually everyone in that whole shelf ends up about an inch or 2 thicker than it was when it started, as everyone ends up as just kind of a gray paste on the back of the wall. You are in a cemetery. There is only so much respectful treatment of human remains can go over the course of 200 years. Now that said, what some of you have also noticed is that many of these older styles of tablets, as in not these newer granite styles, but these older, more traditional marble limestone. The problem with that is the ones from local quarries, they take in a lot of moisture. And so then when those bake out, they start to bend, they start to crack, and pieces will fall out. As you walk around today, you'll see some that have fallen completely on out of the tablet shelving itself. When that happens, the cemetery, by the way, keeps any piece with any identifying information nearby, but everything else gets thrown away. It is considered the responsibility of the tomb owner to go ahead and repair it. Any questions so far? Great, come with me. One final little statement on the upkeep of certain things in the cemetery. If you don't want to have to actually say, if you own a tomb in here and you don't want to have to say, take a hands-on approach to taking care of it, repairing it, and things like that, in the Catholic cemeteries, you can opt for what is called the perpetual care program. As we walk around, you're going to see these little plaques on the floor here, perpetual care. What you do is you pay a whole bunch of money to the Catholic Cemetery organization up front, and they use all the money in that account to cover everything from cleaning to outright physical damage repair of the tombs in that program. And a lot of people do that when they buy these tombs new, if you will. I put air quotes on new because buying a tomb in this cemetery actually means finding an abandoned tomb. And the Catholic Church doesn't consider a tomb abandoned until there has been no contact from the family and no work done on the tomb for 100 years. So also, if you see one that looks in pretty bad shape, but you like the spot, feel free to call up the Catholic Church and start making an offer. But obviously that leads to a lot of very worn down tombs. And so that has led to one particular nonprofit organization in New Orleans I will talk about. So I'm such a big fan of them. That is Save Our Cemeteries. They come on in and they go ahead and they will fix up the foundation of the tomb, go ahead and repair the stucco, even give it a new coat of paint like this one here, which, fun fact, actually a historic color. Originally, walking through the cemetery in New Orleans would have looked just like color-wise walking through the French Quarter. You would actually take the paint from your home and paint up the tomb. That all changed in the 1850s with the Greek Revival architectural movement. They wanted everything to look like Greek architecture, so they painted it all white. There is a historical irony to that, since now we know all those Greek architectural features were also brightly colored, and it turns out the paint just fades after a couple thousand years of no one keeping it up, but I am glad to see these returning, because if anything, didn't like say 10 years, a third of the tombs are all like these bright colors instead of just white. It might keep things a little bit cooler in the cemetery, especially during the summer. Come on with me, we're going to go now ahead and make our way and visit arguably the most famous person in this entire cemetery. So, folks, this tomb here, as some of you have already noticed or caught on to, especially with the helpful historical plaque here, this is the tomb of Marie Laveau, the Queen of New Orleans, and by most statistics, the second most visited grave in the entire United States. Now, Marie Laveau is not, other than this historical marker that was put in the 1970s, Marie Laveau is actually not specifically named on this tomb, which is kind of strange for her, given that she had such notoriety even when she died in 1878. Well, it's thought that that's partly because of the fact that, well, one, there was already quite a bit of scandal about a voodoo priestess being buried in a Catholic cemetery. Not to mention, on top of that, you see this other name that's here a lot, Glapion. That was the name of her white husband in 1878 that she had actually had to break the law to marry. So given that there was already so much scandal, it is thought that they went ahead and kept her name directly off the tablet. But it does reference her in a couple of ways on this top one here. This translates to the family of the widow Paris, one of her many sort of terms for herself in New Orleans. That was the name of her first husband, born Laveau. And then right under here, Marie Salome Glapion, that was one of the children she had with Christophe. I will point out, though, not seeing all the names on a particular tomb, not in itself, not that uncommon in a New Orleans cemetery. Sometimes they just don't end up on there for various different reasons. Financial, family drama, sometimes, to be completely honest. In order to know how many people are buried in a tomb, you actually have to consult the cemetery records. For example, we know for a fact that despite the only 9 names attached here, there are at least 80 people buried in this tomb. And now this tomb, actually, unfortunately to say, is one of the main reasons y'all are sadly not allowed in without a tour guide. It's because several years back, this tomb was in very bad shape. People were marking X's on it, the stucco was falling off, people were even climbing on top of it to take pictures. And so the people who were very historically minded said, Catholic cemeteries, you gotta fix this. Catholic cemeteries said, no, it's not an abandoned tomb. It's not our problem. We know our family's alive and kicking in the Midwest. It's their responsibility. So someone eventually apparently got tired of this, came into the cemetery, and painted the whole tomb bright pink. Now, as I explained, color not the biggest problem. The problem is the type of paint that they use. See, all these tombs need to breathe. Otherwise, the brick they are made of will turn back into mud, and they use latex paint. That's a paint that doesn't breathe. So the Catholic cemeteries had to scrape all that paint off. When they did, they damaged so much of the tomb The courts decided that they needed to be extensively repaired, and the courts told them, look, unless you can figure out who did the kink directly, you're on the hook for it. So they had to repair the tomb for the tune of about $25,000. That is basically why you're not allowed in without a tour guide anymore, so that if you do $25,000 worth of damage to an historic tomb, we're on the hook for it. So please don't. Yes, well, that's because people will still mark them on here. The X's themselves supposedly relate to an ancient voodoo religion. See, so you can still see some things actually that have been left behind, although they do their best to clean it every morning, but people will leave little offerings, which is generally okay. But that is an actual sort of testament within voodoo. You'll leave little coins, you'll leave little consumables. At Marie Laveau in particular, by the way, you'll see people leaving bobby pins and hair ties. That actually owes to her start as a hairdresser in the city of New Orleans, quickly becoming known as one of the best hairdressers in the entire city. But as for the X's themselves, like I said, this all relates to a supposedly ancient voodoo ritual. And to make an offering to a voodoo spirit, and Loa, as they're called, what you do is you come to the tomb, you knock on it 3 times, spin around 3 times, mark 3 X's, and then you leave that offering behind. And if you come back later and that offering is gone, it is said that the spirits have accepted your request. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. The big on a historical level, the biggest being that this ancient voodoo ritual dates back to around 1967. Yeah, we think it was actually some unscrupulous tour guide who wanted to line their pockets a bit, because what they would say when this particular version of it starts cropping up, what do they also say about that offering is, yeah, you know, leave some coins, leave some chocolates, whatever, but if you really want to show your devotion, leave like 20, 50 bucks, leave like a whole bottle of liquor, and if it's gone when you come back, it means the spirits have accepted your request. So yeah, just think about with some tour guy trying to line your pockets. So please do not mark the X's, but do appreciate the tomb itself. Go ahead and grab your pictures. Once you go ahead and have those, we'll go ahead and make our way on through. And while people are taking pictures, any questions so far, even about Marie Laveau stuff? Wonderful. I will cross on over through this information real quick. Oh, sorry. Yeah. They fall down into that area that's like elevated. What about the things that don't have that like elevated area? So there's 2 possible answers to that. Either there is still, even if it's not elevated, don't be elevated per se, there's still going to be the hole that is open to the earth. But also the answer is that some of the ones that seem to be not elevated is simply because the tombs have sunken down. This concrete we're on, that was not put in for our benefit. That was put in the 1960s to stop the cemeteries from sinking. So also, if you see any tombs that look extra small, a little lopsided, yeah, that's not a design choice. It has actually sunken down.
By the way, once the rules here, I can get away with it. No leaning on that.
This tomb here is, well, first off, it is the newest tomb, as in 2009. Thorne is probably the most famous person in the cemetery. yet. Like I said, this came up in 2009. Part of why you don't see that name on the tablet is because, like I said, they're not dead yet. And then the person who owns this tomb is an Italian Catholic, and the Italian Catholics do believe don't put your name on a grave or on a tombstone before you die. That's telling the angel of death to send you on over. This will be the final burial place of our most notorious former celebrity resident. Our national treasure, the ghost writer himself, Mr. Nicolas Cage. Yep. Really, really. In 2006, Nick Cage came on down to New Orleans. He went ahead and fell in love with the place eventually, and he ended up moving down here. He bought a bunch of property, the hauntingly mansion in the French Quarter, a couple of Anne Rice's old mansions in the Garden District. Didn't ingratiate himself with the locals too well, though, by the way. You don't really do celebrity worship here. And he was apparently sort of a "do you know who I am" kind of fella, like threw a lot of tantrums about it, which culminated, by the way, in 2008 when he got arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct a block away from Bourbon Street. Yeah, we didn't know it was possible, so he managed to do it. But apparently he was going through a lot in 2009. It turns out he extra was going through a lot. He hadn't been paying his taxes, so the government came on in, scooped up all his property, started taking all of his liquid assets as well, and that's around the time he apparently decided, well, if I'm going to lose all that cash, I might as well get something I can keep out of it. That is when he bought two historic abandoned tombs right next to each other and put up this massive pyramid. This is Nicolas Cage's last remaining piece of real estate in the city of New Orleans because of a loophole in tax law that says the government can't repossess your burial plot. So, you got a little tax information out of this store. And it's pretty well clean today, I have to say. Sometimes you'll come by, you'll see little smudges. Specifically, you will see little kiss marks on the tomb. It is, some people will go ahead and put on lipstick and kiss the tomb for good luck. I'm going to recommend against that for two reasons. First, I don't think you necessarily want expensive tax dodge luck. That seems like kind of the wrong way to go about things. Also, just a friendly PSA from your tour guide, do not put your lips on anything in or this close to the French Quarter. It's going to end badly. You can interpret that however you want. That makes sense. I didn't hear he was actually in the cemetery yesterday, I guess, checking on his tomb. So. Yep, no, he is in town, so if you look real hard, you just might find him. So one thing I want to point out right next to here is what I particularly want to point out. Don't worry about getting too close, it is pretty faded, but this little circular plaque right here, it has a little Revolutionary War soldier. You can get a little closer if you like. It has a Revolutionary War, just because I think some people really straining the look. It has a little Revolutionary War soldier on it. What that means is that someone in this tomb is actually a veteran of the Revolutionary War. They say because of its age, you can actually find a veteran of every American conflict in this cemetery from the Revolutionary War all the way up to the Gulf. If you don't have the money for a family tomb, but you don't want to go into a wall for the rest of your life. At least historically, back in the 1800s, if you were in New Orleans, you could join what were called benevolent societies. They were basically early forms of like insurance. You'd pay a small monthly fee to the society, and well, one thing that would do is guarantee that if you lost your job or had a sudden medical expense, they'd pay you a little stipend until you got back on your feet. Like I said, early form of insurance. But what that small monthly fee would also do typically in New Orleans was guarantee the construction of, and you and your immediate families placed in one of these societies too. And plenty of the ones that are most opulent in this cemetery are all built along heritage law. This one here is the second Portuguese society too. That is the Spanish society. You got the French society over there with its own little tomb on top of it. But most opulent is this one right here. You almost, between that marble and the iron and the statuary, you almost don't even need a column. This is the Italian society too. And now I will point out, by the way, time, and more specifically grave robbing, not been kind to many of the statues of St. Louis #1. That's the real tragedy here. That's not natural wear and tear. Those heads missing from Mother Charity and those orphans she's taking in, those heads are probably sitting in someone's private collection as we speak. But as for the construction itself, it started going up in 1841, and it's from the on from the word go, the Italian society spared no expense. They imported Italian marble, they imported Italian iron, they even imported an Italian architect, a guy by the name of Virreal. When he finishes it in 1850, it cost anywhere between $45,000. That's the equivalent of about $1 to $2 million today, which means adjusted for inflation, this is the most expensive tomb in the entire cemetery, and this is the back of it. We're going to go and take a look at the front in just a second. Any questions so far, though? Excellent. Come with me. Over here is even more obvious that it is the Italian film. You've got Italia, you've got that statue up there, which every now and again I'll hear some tour guide say that's the Virgin Mary, which, like, the Virgin Mary doesn't really tend to go for an off-the-shoulder look too often. That is the personification of Mother Italy herself. Now, when Pietro finishes this in 1850, not only is it massively expensive, but it's a great work of art. He considers it his best work of art ever. What do you think you do when you're an artist and you finish what you consider to be your masterwork, or any work of art? That's right, you sign it. It's chiseled right there into the marble. Yes or no, architectural. But what do I also tell you about Italian Catholics and putting your name on a tomb before you're dead? Pietro dies 3 days after the tomb is finished. He's the first person to ever be buried in it. Yeah, should have heeded the tradition a little bit better. For those of you curious, he died of yellow fever. Fun fact, a lot of people did back then. Now, if that statue itself was familiar, by the way, you might have seen it in the 1969 movie Easy Break. Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper are playing motorcycle hitchhikers in the movie, and near the end, they come to New Orleans. They hang out in this cemetery. They drink a bunch of alcohol, do a bunch of drugs, which were very real on set, by the way. And then they go ahead and they start climbing on a bunch of these historic tombs, including a very famous shot in the sequence where Peter Fonda is having a very real acid trip on the lap of that statue. As you can imagine, the Catholic Church did not grant them permission to do this. Yeah, because technically back then to film in this cemetery, in addition to permission from the city, you need to submit your script for approval from the Catholic Church. So knowing that the Catholic Church was not going to approve it, they just hopped the fence, shot the whole thing guerrilla style. And when the Catholic Church found out about it, they were so upset by this desecration of their sacred site that they had forbidden any filming in any Catholic cemetery in the city ever since. And so that's why if you have seen a New Orleans cemetery in a movie, TV show, or even apparently several music videos ever since 1969, and it wasn't a set, it's probably Lafayette number 1 over in the Garden District. It's the oldest city-owned cemetery, and so that's how they can just go ahead and get the permits for that one. Any questions? Great. How long? Yeah. One of our important civil rights figures in New Orleans and really in the country. So this is also where I'm going to quickly go ahead and test your middle and high school history knowledge real quick. This is the tune. Yeah. That's the reaction I usually get. This is the tune of Homer Plussing. That name strike a bell to anyone? Give you another hint. He was the plaintiff in the Homer versus early morning. I've not had all my coffee. He was the plaintiff in the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896. Yes, that is the case that gives us the separate but equal clause. The Homer Plessy, he was living in New Orleans in the early 1890s, and he was a man of color, and he was also very light-skinned, so he could pass for white. And he was a member of an organization that worked for the advancement of human rights here in New Orleans. Now, in Louisiana in the early 1890s, the state passes the Separate Train Car Act, enforcing racial segregation along trains. No one in New Orleans is particularly happy about this. Important for the story, neither Homer's organization or the train company themselves, because now they've got to pay more extra money to put more cars on their train whenever going to Louisiana. So they set up a test case together. They work the whole thing out behind the scenes. Homer goes to the station, orders a ticket, and since he's very light-skinned, they give him a ticket for the white-only car. He gets on, the train starts moving, and then he tells the conductor when he comes by, well, actually, I'm black. Conductor tells him he's got to move, he refuses, at which point the organization is paid to have a private investigator on that train stand up, identify himself, and say, I am arresting this man in violation of the Separate Train Car Act. That way he's charged with that specific crime, so that they can challenge that one in court. And then they get to the next station where the police and the press are waiting. Police are there to officially take him into state custody, and the press are there for two reasons. Makes it a very high-profile case the Supreme Court's already looking at, and it also goes ahead and it makes a public record of his arrest. So, like, the police can't just go ahead and say, take you to a back alley somewhere and deal with him extrajudicially. They're going to have to actually process him properly. And so it goes before Judge Ferguson in New Orleans, who ends up ruling in favor of the Separate Train Car Act. And so then it goes before the Supreme Court, where in 1896, Homer's legal team makes an argument that essentially boils down to this. You sold this man a ticket for the white-only car, even though he's black. That's because they couldn't tell. That means you can't enforce this law across the board equally. That makes it unconstitutional. Unfortunately, though, with only one judge dissenting, the Supreme Court upholds the Separate Train Car Act. They say, you make a good point, though, about equal treatment under the law, so we're going to say you can have separate facilities as long as they are of equal quality. Gives us the separate but equal clause. And of course, while always separate, the facilities were never equal, and you don't have to think too hard to figure out who gets the short end of that one. And this decision is not overturned until 1954's Brown versus Board of Education, and that to me is the real tragedy for Homer here, that he died in 1925, just under 30 years before seeing this decision overturned. There's a very real chance he went to his grave thinking he made the situation worse. But what I try to take from this, and what I hope was perhaps a shared philosophy of his, is that I do truly believe that we are obligated to the society we live in to plant the seeds for a better future, even if we are not going to be the ones to reap that harvest in our lifetime. Now, as we move on from this one, there is a lengthy plaque on the other side of this tomb, and it just has some of the more names and dates. We unfortunately don't have time to stop and read it, but what I recommend, if you're interested in it, go ahead and take a picture of it, and then go ahead and give it a read once you're done with one. Of the cemetery. Also referred to when it first opened up as the Cemetery of the Heretics. Great band name, by the way. Now, this is necessitated after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. A bunch of Americans start coming into the city, But they're not used to buffs and diseases yet, so they start dropping like flies immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean within about a few weeks. So they don't have any of their own infrastructure yet. They don't have a cemetery. So they go to the Catholic Church and they ask them, look, we know we're Protestant, but can we put some of our people in your cemetery? Just temporarily, just for a little while. We'll move them once we have our own. And the Catholic Church, in an absolutely heartwarming display of Christian fellowship and brotherhood, say no, absolutely not. Catholic only. But then a few more people die and they ask a couple more times. And so then the Catholic Church says, fine, you can put them in the cemetery, but we don't want to have to look at them. So put them in the backyard. Where they are here. Now, you'll notice with many of these along this way, when the Americans came down, they saw all these above ground tombs as just fancy European nonsense. They were going to be buried in the ground, like good, honest Americans. But they had also heard about, there were problems with burying people underground even back then. They did tend to come back up during a heavy rainstorm. They got a little squeamish about that. So they would build these British shafts 6 feet down, and then lay capstones on top of them so that the coffin couldn't float around and couldn't come back up. Or at least not fully. They'd come up just enough and then go ahead and start rocking against those capstones, tap, tap, tap. Catholic mothers were known to walk their children by the cemetery after a rainstorm, point out the tapping coffins to their children and say, you hear that? That's the Protestants trying to claw their way up out of hell. Not a lot of religious tolerance back anymore. Of the first wife and daughter of William Claiborne. William Claiborne was the first American governor of Louisiana, so he comes down in 1803, appointed right after the purchase, with his family, and in 1804, his wife and his daughter die of yellow fever on the same day. Very tragic occurrence, but also a very common occurrence back then. And William Claiborne is so distraught, he tells the architect that he wants to redesign their grave. He says, I want to build somewhere into it that I can always come and sit and stare at the tomb itself and reflect upon the good times with my wife and my daughter. And so that is what this little sunken in section is for. That isn't the sinking the way the rest of the graves have sunk down in the cemetery. That's its original design. This is all a sitting wall so that you can come and sit and stare at the tomb and reflect on those good times. And this tomb, believe it or not, this drains better even than some of the concrete in the cemetery. Like you think, given this city and how much it rains, that would basically be a moat half the time. But like I said, honestly, this will be completely drained even just about an hour at most after even a heavy rainstorm. It was very well designed by one of the most prominent and big deal American architects, not just of the time, but in our entire history, a guy by the name of Benjamin LaCroix. If you're not familiar with the name, you're certainly familiar with at least some of his work. He's the guy who designed the Capitol building over in Washington, D.C. Again, he also came down after the purchase, spent a lot of his time building buildings and designing tombs for a lot of the wealthy Americans who came on down. You'll notice that this one here has kind of similar design principles. I think that's similar to in Sydney and very well designed sort of like drainage section in it. That's because it's for a similar purpose. This is the tomb for Mrs. Claiborne, number 2. See, after William Claiborne decided he was ready to get back out there, he was also a politician, so he figured the best way to get in good with the locals is to marry a good local girl. So of course she's Catholic. So when she also unfortunately dies several years later, also of yellow fever, she can be buried right here on the Catholic side. Somebody puts the graves though right across the street from one another, which has to make visiting very convenient on the day. Now, people will ask, so which one's he buried with? Was he with the first wife? Did he convert to Catholicism and get buried with the second wife? Neither. William Claiborne is buried in Metairie Cemetery next to Mrs. Claiborne number 3. Don't read too much into that. They kind of all got around a lot back then. Like, give you an idea that his third wife outlived him. So while she's buried next to him, guess who's buried next to her? Her second husband. Yeah, it's a lot of weird things going on in the New Orleans afterlife. Now, I already explained the X's and why those don't really hold water, but it's actually called the faux leveau, because every now and again, you'll start hearing some rumor that actually, they actually buried her here. Or my favorite is when they say, the Catholic Church recently has gotten tired of people visiting that tomb, so they moved it on over to this other tomb. The latter is especially funny to me, because I already told y'all what happens to the remains. They would not be able to know which ones are hers. Like, now, I think, once again, this came from some sort of unscrupulous tour guide on a particularly hot day, long line at Marie Laveau's tomb, who just said, no, it's this one. This is the real place she's buried. I like pointing it out, though, because it gives you an idea of the extent of that renovation that was done on it, because if you look up pictures, for example, of Marie Laveau's tomb before that major renovation, it looks very much like this one. The level of X's, the level of stucco falling apart, and all the brick that has been just really starting to be destroyed. Now, also, we did at least do two things, that at least there was an actual voodoo practitioner in Dr. John. Not the musician who unfortunately left us last year. We were talking of, he actually took his name from the historical figure. But about 4 years ago, we also discovered that Dr. John is actually buried in a completely different cemetery. So we have no idea who's buried in this one. Hopefully, someone who doesn't mind all the X's. Come on. And you stick close, this is the part, just because this is the part of the cemetery where it's particularly named one. So this tomb right here, this is actually basically the last active society tomb in this cemetery. Like all the other ones I showed you, they're kept up as historical monuments. This one started as a much older sort of general society tomb, but it was abandoned by the 1930s. And so it was brought down by the Barber family. They're a very important Cosmic jazz family here in New Orleans. Like the guy Pop Barbering basically helped with one of the people who actually helped to create jazz in that 1890s period. And so they're able to go ahead and get it as their family tomb. Use it only as that until about 2012 is fast forward to. A musician by the name of Lloyd Washington died. He was a member of the band who Peace Loves. Now, right, he died like a lot of New Orleans musicians died, which is to say incredibly poor. His family has no way to go ahead and bury it, because burial has also gotten very expensive at that point in New Orleans. So for the first year after his death, Lloyd Washington sits in an urn or shelf in his favorite farm in the city of New Orleans. Stop right there for me, that's perfect. But understandably, Lloyd's family wants something a little more enduring for his legacy. So in 2005, they contacted Barbers and they asked them, hey, do you have any room in your tomb for Lloyd? And they said, yeah, we'd be honored to go ahead and have him come on in. Please bring him by. And then they get thinking that despite the fact that they're so important to the history and culture of New Orleans, many of our musicians live and die very poor. And so that is when they then volunteer their family to as the New Orleans musicians do. Sometimes also called the Musicians Society. If you are a musician living and working in the city of New Orleans and upon your death, you may very well go ahead and be invited by the Barberins to go ahead and be entombed at their gravesite. And so that means along this side of the wall, we've actually got several different plaques commemorating some of the musical figures in here. Also, how I mentioned we still bury people living here to this day. We had about 6 in the cemetery last year. 2 of them were right in here. This was particularly named out right here. This veteran here, April of 2019. Buried right here in the cemetery. It's also the tomb that served as a burial spot just last weekend as well. And so as we move along, what I want to, you can't really, it's difficult to see from here, but as we move along, take a look back, what you're going to see up there, and you can still make it out somewhat, is that iron cross, and it's got a glass note in it, the blue note, and that was made when it turned into the musician's tomb. It symbolizes the blue notes of jazz, an important musical theory component to that entire genre of music.
And then yellow fever bill, and it would help with the fever. And then later, Tennessee.
I've got to show you, I'd be remiss if I didn't also point out the oldest tomb in the entire cemetery. This one right here. Looks like it's in pretty good condition. Looks someone bought it in summer of 2018 and the latest they got was a perpetual care plaque. Now, fun fact, it is when they bought it that we learned it was the oldest tomb. We originally thought it was a different one, but when they bought it, they bought the perpetual care contract. The workers go on in, they start opening it up to go ahead and look inside, see what foundational work needs to be done. And as soon as they open the tablet, right behind that tablet, so protected from all that heat, they find something you don't normally find in these historic tombs. They found the original bill of sale, which unfortunately, I know, right? Now, unfortunately, they weren't able to get a name off of it, but if you describe her as a young woman going to be buried in this tomb in her teenage years, in 1792. That's just 3 years after the construction and opening of this cemetery. It makes it possibly the oldest confirmed marked grave in the city of New Orleans. This is the other thing I mean when I say that this is an active cemetery is that we are still learning about our history and heritage through restoration and renovation efforts. And in addition to me just finding that pantry very cool, I'm a bit of a history nerd, as may have gotten, it also means I do owe y'all a bit of gratitude for this interest that people like to have in the cemetery that keep it up. And I'm not just speaking abstractly, though that does also certainly help. I mean, just so you know, part of your fee in coming in to take this tour goes towards the Metaverse Cemeteries organization. We donate to the Save Our Cemetery nonprofit. So by taking this tour, you would also actually help to go ahead and keep the cemetery up and standing and around. So sincerely, thank you. This tour is one of my big, big passions. So sincerely, thank you so much. Now that said, before I walk a bit more to the gate and say goodbye, do y'all have any questions for me? So, alright. Okay, if you think of any once we're at the gate, go ahead and feel free to ask us. I'll be more time now. That's